Hi, everybody, and welcome to our winter Headwaters Research Experience presentation night. We are super excited for tonight. We have three fantastic projects. All of these students have worked really hard all semester. And if you don't know that much about the research experience, we start all the way at the beginning, 10, 11 weeks ago, with asking the students to think about what they are most interested in, what they have questions about in the world. And we help them craft a research question that is a testable question. We do a whole bunch of background research with scientific literature, and we find papers to read, and we look and we see what science is already out there on the topic. That really informs the hypothesis that the students are creating. And then we go through a experimental design process where we figure out what kind of variables, what kind of data the students need to collect. And then they have a few weeks to go out and collect their data on their own. For some of them, that looks like um, gathering data from the internet, like pre-published data sets, often government data sets or something like that. For some of them, and they might be going out into the field and using scientific equipment to collect data. And for some students, it might be something like a survey and collecting data that way from their peers. And then we move into our final kind of segment of the course of data analysis, and we do some statistics. We figure out what our results are, and then you all are here tonight to see the ultimate finished product. And so we're really excited to have these presentations, and we have everyone's mentors here as well. And so without further ado, I'm going to bring up our first mentor-student pair. I'm going to bring up Sean and have him introduce Hugo and his presentation.
All right. Hi, everyone. How are we doing tonight? Thank you for joining us. Yeah, so it is my pleasure to introduce my student who I've been working with, Hugo. And Hugo has got some interesting research questions and things, and through the field, I'm not going to give away and take away his thunder, but through researching toxicology and what that does to invertebrate species and how that affects essentially, right, how that can affect us as a human species and what that means to us moving forward. So I'm going to let him take it over.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Sean. Hi, my name is Hugo Zorn, and this is my presentation on the correlation of pesticide concentration on honeybee colony health. So, just some background information, as I'm sure a lot of you know, but pollinators are vital for producing about 75% of the world's crops, which includes staples like almonds, berries, apples, and many other vegetables. Their contribution to global agriculture is enormous, and it is valued somewhere between $235 to $577 billion every year, which makes their decline a serious economic and ecological concern. So, as I just mentioned, there have been a large decline in population recently, and their losses are alarmingly high, with global loss rates ranging from 30 to 50%, and winter loss rates in the US averaging around 40%. This indicates both a persistent and widespread problem that threatens not only the food security, but also the stability of entire ecosystems. So there are quite a few different factors that have an impact in this decline, such as diseases and poor diets. But the factor that I'm most focused on, that I believe that has the biggest impact, is pesticide exposure, which is increasingly recognized as a major factor. And I really believe that by understanding the factors that are causing this decline in population, we can develop different strategies to try and protect these pollinators and to try and ensure agricultural sustainability. So my research question asked whether higher concentration of pesticides found in hive pollen are linked with increased colony losses. And kind of in response to this question, my hypothesis was that increased pesticide concentrations in hive pollen will significantly correlate with negative colony health. And to really illustrate the amount of pesticides that are being found inside these hives, I have a graph from the National Institute of Health, which illustrates the frequency of pesticide residues that were detected in hive pollen samples. And so, looking at this graph, one key observation that I made was that a substantial portion of the pollen samples that they collected through the study contained pesticides, with, I believe it was neonicotinoids and fungicides being the most prevalent. And there are a lot of implications for finding these pesticides. And so it really shows that these bees are being routinely exposed again and again to multiple different pesticides, which I believe is causing a large part of that decrease in population. So my methods for collecting data, I believe it was mentioned earlier, but it wasn't possible for me to go out in the field. So I went through a lot of peer research papers, and I did some collection, extraction, and synthesis. So it was a process of going through a lot of articles focused on the effect of pesticides, and then extracting relevant data, which includes graphs, charts, and statistical analyses, and then just going through them and trying to find kind of different like patterns or correlations between pesticide exposure and the ultimate colony health outcomes. And then, yeah, for my first piece of data, this comes from a study from the National Institute of Health. There are two panels. In the first one, panel A, it shows the time in seconds bees took to learn the foraging task, and control bees took longer to learn, while pesticide-exposed bees were able to learn a little bit more quickly. And the second panel over here, it shows the number of flowers visited before learning, and how control bees visited more flowers, while pesticide-exposed bees learned after visiting fewer flowers. And although this wasn't like the conclusion I'd hoped to see, it still shows that even low doses of pesticide can alter bee foraging behavior. And so these changes can disrupt their normal foraging patterns and potentially affect the overall colony performance and health. And then to go along with that, this is a graph from Science study examining how neonicotinoid, which is a specific type of pesticide, affects bee reproduction. And so the first panel over here shows that as neonicotinoid residue increases, Bombus terrestis, which is a specific species of bee, their colonies were able to produce fewer queens. And then in the second panel, neonicotinoids, like higher levels resulted in fewer brood cells, which are the offspring produced by Osmia bicornis, which is again another species of bee. And this, to me, shows how higher pesticide levels kind of imply that the bee reproduction becomes worse. It's less effective and less efficient. And so that goes back to my hypothesis. And they're not able to remain at a stable population or to continue reproducing with higher levels of pesticide. And then that goes towards this next data, which comes from the National Institute of Health again. And it shows there's two different panels. The first panel is the control group, which wasn't exposed to pesticides. And this is during planting. So as it goes from 0 to 100%, the mortality remains relatively low and consistent. And then when the bees were exposed to pesticides during planting, the mortality was significantly higher, and it was a lot more. It had a lot more variety to it. So that really shows the unpredictable and really dangerous nature of pesticides, and it shows how more pesticides on average equals higher levels of mortality, which aligns with my hypothesis and can kind of show how it's one of the main reasons for this decline in population. And then for my final piece of data, it's a specific pesticide called clothianidin, which is it's the impact on bee foraging behavior. And this shows in panel A that bees exposed to clothianidin visited fewer flowers compared to the control group. In panel B, bees exposed to clothianidin, their searching time, which is the time spent finding flowers, was longer than the control group. And in panel C, the time spent on each flower is also higher with clothianidin treatment, especially for certain flower species. So this connects to my original hypothesis in that the pesticides kind of disrupted the normal foraging behaviors that you'd expect a bee to have. So there were fewer flower visits, longer searching times, and just overall slower foraging. And this really highlights how pesticides have a lot of negative effects on bees and how their foraging behavior can impact their survival rate and their performance. So, in conclusion, my research and the data I gathered shows that the higher pesticide levels a colony has, the more negative effects it experiences. So, from my research, I was able to deduce that it can lead to reduced reproduction, it can lead to higher mortality rates, to altered learning and foraging behavior, to normal disrupting normal foraging patterns, and just overall, it demonstrated to me the detrimental impacts on the colony's survival. Um, and so I believe that pesticides are one of, if not the greatest factors in the decline in the population. And I believe it is a major threat to the survival of bees. So before I open the floor to any questions, I have a few acknowledgments for some people who encouraged me and helped me through this project. So Sean Wesley, who was my mentor, he was very encouraging, and I was very inspired by him. I'd like to thank the whole Headwaters team, so Bria, Megan, and my peers. They kind of guided me, and I definitely learned a lot through that process. I'd like to thank my friends and parents for their support, and the Eco Innovate contest for the inspiration to pursue this project. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I'll open the floor to any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Hugo. Great job. I'll turn it over to Sean first, who might have some specific questions, and then I have a couple for you too.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, Hugo, you know where I'm going to go with this. I like to give you thought questions, right, or something philosophical. So as far as, right, we see how intelligent bees are, if we use their common name, and I think people sometimes don't understand that, but what's your thoughts, I guess, moving forward, looking at, do you think that there will be detriment to, right, we understand that there will be detriment to their health as an overall, but do you think that they will eventually start to maybe alter some of their patterns going forward to not, induce as much toxic pollen and other or be around the toxic plants, right? We've seen other species will move when pesticides are sprayed into fields and ag fields, and eventually either come back after rain or something that can wash some of that out. What are your thoughts, kind of, as you've been reading some of these papers? Do you think that bees have a way to maybe kind of adapt or change, right, some of that behavior?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. When looking through a lot of papers, one thing I noticed is that bees, they are very intelligent. And so there's one kind of thing that a lot of professionals and scientists have been noticing, which is sometimes bees will migrate to areas with lower pesticide concentrations. Um, so I think that's one of the ways. This is very early on, so we really haven't seen that much
Mm-hmm.
yet. But that's one of the ways that they're trying to get around it. But I definitely believe that they are developing and they will develop other ways to try to mitigate the effects of pesticides.
Excellent. Yeah, it seems like you said it's kind of young, but that's kind of the general consensus, right? Is that we're moving that direction, or at least that thought. I guess second part to that question, because this is my favorite part. What was the coolest factoid that you learned while finding some of these papers? Because obviously you know a lot about this topic beforehand, right? You had a lot of knowledge going in, but is there something else that you found that was really interesting that really kind of struck a chord with you?
Ooh, that's an interesting question.
Hmm.
Okay, so my
That's
first, like,
why.
yeah, my original topic was the impact of pesticides on
Mm,
the spread of diseases. Um, but I wasn't able to find enough data for that, so I had to switch it a little bit.
right, right.
But I think one interesting factoid I learned is really the effects that pesticides can have on diseases. So I thought one thing that was really interesting is that in some bees, um, some diseases were negatively impacted, but then other diseases, it actually was beneficial to have pesticides inside of the colonies. Um, so overall, I think pesticides are very harmful, but I thought it was really interesting how in some cases they can be useful to bees.
Excellent. Yeah. All right. I mean, there's always something that you kind of find that's just that little nugget of information that's like, whoa, I never would have thought this if we hadn't gone down this path. So, but I want to
Mhm.
say, great job. You've done a terrific job with this. So,
Thank you.
Awesome. That fact is interesting because one of the questions that I had written down for you was just in your data collection and all of your research, I was wondering how you were addressing some of the unknowns or like the unpredictable nature of the impacts of pesticides. So is that that fact is interesting. What did you do about that with your data?
Um, well, that was for a different kind of topic than the one I presented today. But there were definitely a few instances of that. So I believe I went over one of them. Here, let me try and pull it up. But here in foraging, it actually made um, bees better at it. So they're able to learn it quicker
Yeah.
under pesticides, which I thought was really weird because it was not what I expected at all. But I thought it would be useful to include just because that's definitely part of it. It's not all bad necessarily.
Mhm. Interesting. My other question for you about that was just
Mm,
thinking, I know when you were looking for data, a lot of the data around bee colony, bee populations and bee colonies is coming from agricultural data, right? And so there's so many managed populations of honeybees,
mm.
specifically, like especially for agricultural benefits. Um, what does that mean for your research? And would you think about doing anything differently or trying to get other data in the future?
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of mine came from really large studies done, and the bees I think were mostly bees that were, I mean, very well monitored, but they were used often for agriculture. So I feel like to have probably a more accurate sense it would be to get a bigger sample size of bees that are both used in agriculture and not. Um, so to try to find bees that are maybe not exposed to as many pesticides, because a lot of the bees that are exposed to pesticides are because those pesticides are being used in agriculture. So I think the bees that aren't being used for agriculture may be different, may have different results for all of those tests.
Yeah, interesting. All right, and final question for you. What was something either challenging or surprising or your favorite part of just like the whole research process?
Okay, my favorite part was, I don't know, that's hard to say, but I think it was working with all of you, and really, well, I feel like I learned a lot about collecting data, about researching, about all of that. And I think the most challenging part was probably also finding data. It can be really difficult to find if you don't know where to look. And even when you do know where to look, I feel like it's still difficult, especially for my topic. So probably data collection.
Yeah, even if you find data that seems like it's the right data, you might have to spend quite some time making it into something that you can actually use.
Definitely.
Awesome. Well, great job. Looking forward to reading your full manuscript and seeing the rest of the data as soon as you do end up manipulating that into a good way that you can use it. And I think that you have some really awesome conclusions and like interesting questions here.
Mhm.
So great work this semester on that.
Thank you.
Awesome. And I am going to bring up Megan Schwartz now and have her introduce her pair of wonderful students, Dia and Itzel.
Hi, everybody. Thank you again for being here tonight. It's been a pleasure working with these two bright students on something that is very pertinent and important to all of us here, especially at Headwaters. These two have studied and researched hard on a subject that's very near and dear to them regarding first generation students, and I don't want to take away from it. So without further ado, Dia and Itzel.
Hello, everybody. We would just like to preface this by saying how grateful we are for you guys to be here and like to listen to us. Our names are Dia Patel,
and I'm Itzel Orellana.
And for our Headwaters research experience, we decided to do first generation mentorship research.
As first generation students who receive mentorship through the Upward Bound program, we were curious towards the effect mentorship has on first generation students. Seeing the differences in academic performance and academic self-efficacy within ourselves and our peers inspired us to focus on this topic for our self-driven research. This personal experience through Upward Bound has led us to the research question:
can mentorship be used to predict academic success and or academic self-efficacy for first generation students? This ultimately led us to our hypothesis that although many first generation students might already display academic success, we hypothesized that mentorship might help exemplify the growth in academic self-efficacy for first generation students, which correlates with their educational performance.
We presume first generation students are positively affected in their academic self-efficacy, specifically in overcoming imposter syndrome due to the accordance of academic reassurance through mentorship.
Ultimately, due to mentorship, first generation students are positively affected in their academic success due to the access of supplementary resources. So before we start, we would like to do a literature review. We sought out many peer-reviewed articles to determine the connection between first generation students and mentorship. This ultimately helped us get a general knowledge of how first generation students are doing in their academic pathway today. So firstly, prior research that was conducted showed first generation students struggle with poor academic integration, social integration, and the balance between work and family responsibilities, and that mentorship policy increases the growth of academic and professional development in students. And lastly, that mentorship has become a vital correlation that has increased the confidence of first generation students, which ultimately creates high academic self-efficacy in them. So again, we would like to introduce two terms that many people might not be familiar with. The first one is first generation student. This is a student whose parents have not received a bachelor's degree. And the second term is self-efficacy, an individual's belief in themselves to accomplish specific goals.
Our methods throughout this research program was that we conducted a Google survey for first generation and non-first generation students to determine the role that mentorship has played on their academic performance and academic self-efficacy. Survey questions included the following, such as demographics like level of education, ethnicity/race, gender, and socioeconomic status. We also included the question whether they have or haven't received the mentorship, and if they had, the longitude and type of mentorship. We lastly did Likert 1 through 5 scales to evaluate students' academic performance and academic self-efficacy. For the students who have received the mentorship, we asked them to answer the following questions before, during, and after receiving mentorship.
How confident do you feel in an academic setting? How would you rate your academic performance? How confident do you feel in a professional setting? And how motivated do you feel academically?
Then we refined the dataset to specify categories when free response was an option and transformed our raw data into variables that can be statistically graphed and analyzed.
For example, if someone wrote, I've been in upward bound for 2 years, we then put it 2 years upward bound. We then grouped up the GPAs into categories, which made it easier to graph statistically. We then calculated the difference of responses from the Likert scales before and after mentorship to see the improvement.
I would like to introduce our summary statistics. Overall, we had a total of 200 responses for our survey. 93.5% of our responses were first generation students. If you look over to the right, you can see the graph that shows the correlation between first generation students and non-first generation students and whether they have or haven't received mentorship. As you can see, we had an overwhelming response of first generation students who do receive mentorship. We were then able to statistically graph our data through Data Classroom by using comparing groups and graph portions. Graph portions demonstrated how data is distributed among different categories, and comparing groups demonstrated the comparison of 2 or more groups of numerical measurements, such as the shape of data and mean of groups. We then used graph-driven tests, such as t-test, which determined the test of independence, chi-square test, which determined goodness of fit, and a two-way ANOVA test that analyzes the difference of the mean between more than 2 groups. These statistical tests helped us determine the p-value of each graph. Our first graph that we would like to introduce is the key findings of academic performance and motivation. This graph shows the difference of academic performance and motivation between first generation students and non-first generation students. As you can see, this graph has a p-value of 0.02, which means that there's a very strong confidence that the groups are different. Students who are not first generation students were more likely to evaluate themselves at a higher scale for academic motivation than students who were first generation students. When analyzing the graphs of academic performance, which had a p-value of 0.86, there was no significant statistical difference between first generation students and non-first generation students. This ultimately means that when we asked them to evaluate their academic performance, there was not a difference between first generation students and non-first generation students. Our second graph introduces the key findings of academic performance and motivation of students who do receive mentorship and students who do not receive mentorship. The graph to the right shows how students who receive mentorship and do not receive mentorship would evaluate their academic performance. This graph has a p-value of less than 0.01, which means there's an extreme strong confidence that the groups are different. Students who do receive mentorship are more likely to evaluate themselves at a higher scale when it came to academic performance rather than those who do not receive mentorship. The graph on the left demonstrates how students who do receive mentorship and don't receive mentorship would evaluate themselves on an academic motivation scale. This graph also has a p-value of 0.02, meaning that students who do not have mentorship are more likely to evaluate themselves at a lower scale when it came to academic motivation. This graph was used to determine the academic performance. We used the variable GPA to determine the academic performance of first-generation students and non-first generation students. This graph, for this graph, we ran an ANOVA test, and it showed the p-values down below, meaning that there's no evidence that the effect of X depends on Z, and there's no evidence that there are differences between these groups. This ultimately means that our data showed that whether you're first generation or not, and whether you receive mentorship or not, there is no difference between the GPAs of those students. For our key findings in self-efficacy and confidence between first-generation students and non-first-generation students, the graph to the right shows how non-first-generation students are more likely to evaluate themselves at a higher scale than those who are first-generation students in a professional setting. The p-value of both of these graphs are 0.02, which means that there's a very strong confidence that the groups are different. The graph to the left also shows that non-first generation students are more likely to have a higher confidence in the academic setting. When analyzing the graph of confidence level, which had a p-value of 0.71, there was no significant statistical difference between first generation students and non-first generation students. Lastly, our key findings between students who receive mentorship and do not receive mentorship. Their confidence level showed that the students who do receive mentorship have an overall higher confidence than those who do not receive mentorship. However, when analyzing the graphs of their academic self-efficacy, which had a p-value of 0.15, and professional self-efficacy, which had a p-value of 0.47, there was no significant statistical difference between first-generation students with mentorship and first-generation students without mentorship. Ultimately, our results showed that our hypothesis was partially supported, as our findings show that first-generation students who receive mentorship have general satisfaction in academic performance, academic motivation, and self-efficacy in both an academic and professional setting, compared to those who are non-first generation students and those who are first generation students but do not receive mentorship.
So for our discussion, the factors that impacted our data was that the survey was only ran in Reno, Nevada. This led to an unequal amount of participants for each variable, which made these graphs kind of similar or have no difference at all. Next time, we could have approached the study differently by conducting wider scale research for how mentorship affects students not only in our specific region. We were thinking of doing it maybe statewide or nationwide about how first generation students are affected by mentorship. In the future, we want to run the study but conduct different research on various groups, as well as get equal participants for each variable. For example, we could do the research question, how do different socioeconomic groups get impacted by mentorship? So before we get into the questions, we would like to acknowledge and thank Megan Joyce and Megan Schwartz for guiding us through this project, as well as aiding us whenever we had questions or needed clarification. Megan Joyce held a class every Thursday, and that really helped in aiding our research and helping us know what to do for our manuscript and our presentation. Megan Schwartz helped us through our manuscript and presentation, as well as helping us decide how to do the survey and how to put that in data classroom.
We also appreciate Upward Bound, a program for first generation students helping our survey reach more and more students. Without Upward Bound, me and Dia would not have this opportunity.
We are also grateful for the participants that participate in the survey to make the study possible. Without them, this wouldn't have been able to further discuss in the future, and it wouldn't aid in future research.
Lastly, we would like to thank all our friends and family watching us right now. We greatly appreciate all your support along this journey.
Thank you.
Awesome job, you two. Such robust questions. I know your survey was pretty long. You had so much data, and that meant you have so many results. So that's awesome, and really leads me to my first question for you, which is, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the process of going from thinking you wanted to research stereotypes and like those impacts to figuring out how to actually measure something quantifiable from your survey. Talk about that a little bit.
So originally, me and Dia ultimately wanted to basically break the stereotypes that have been imposed on many first-generation students. However, we weren't sure how to tackle those stereotypes. Therefore, we decided to make our research question a little bit more concise and focus on those that the variables that really matter to us, which was academic performance and academic self-efficacy. As we mentioned before, we've seen it within ourselves and we've seen it within our peers. So that kind of led us to focus mainly on academic self-efficacy and academic performance and how mentorship can help students break those stereotypes that society has imposed on them.
Yes, and as Itzel said, I think those were the two kind of overarching stereotypes that every time we would research, that's what the article was about, how first-time students struggle with those. And I think with Megan Schwartz helping us make our survey that determined their confidence and their performance, it really just helped us kind of know the importance of researching that and also allowed us to make the study possible.
Following up that question, how, I guess we had a very short amount of time. It took us a while to create our survey and then distribute it. We needed to collect it all to have enough time to analyze it at the end. How, if you had, right, infinite funding, infinite time to work on your research, how do you think it would change your results if those same people you were able to survey and follow throughout their mentorship and check in with them in the moment rather than defining their self-efficacy in the past, how they might have felt?
I feel like it would contribute to our data by making it more statistically different. I think for some of our graphs, we had like a p-value that had no difference, and I think if we were able to get the survey out to more people that like weren't in our region, we could have like really seen the difference that mentorship makes and how students without mentorship struggle and how students with mentorship like prevail.
Adding on to that, like Dia mentioned, I think the reason why we had many graphs that had little significant difference was because we ultimately had a huge number of first generation students who do not receive mentorship or who do receive mentorship, which ultimately kind of threw our graphs off. I think if we had more time, we would make our survey more reachable to those who are first generation students but do not receive mentorship, or those who aren't first generation students but do receive mentorship, just to overall really see a difference, as well as perhaps like conduct different surveys and like improve our survey, therefore we could get more information about their mentorship type.
I also think that like since our survey was kind of like concise into more high school students, I think if we were able to reach like different grade levels, like college or like more participants in kind of higher education, we would have been able to get like statistically like really different results, because like mentorship affects different grades differently, and as you grow you kind of realize that.
That's great. Yeah. The other question I thought of as we were kind of going through, right? We didn't have enough time, but mentorship can be very, um, you know, really important and cool, but what role do you see like peer community and community itself, like the support side? Do you think you would see those same correlations in your data if you were to ask questions about how many peers they had following the same mentorship protocol versus just getting tutoring alone? You both are a part of a really cool program that you have this great community surrounding you. What do you think it's like for groups that maybe don't have that same community?
I feel like for those who might not have the same community that we do, I think that would overall impact their self-efficacy part of this our research, since personally speaking, we've experienced improvement in our self-efficacy through mentorship, like you said, because we have a community and we have that support. And I feel like many of our peers in this program also relate to that. So I think if we were to analyze the students who like just receive after school tutoring or less mentorship, I think their answers for academic self-efficacy would be totally different from those who receive long-term mentorship.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I feel like in our survey, we asked the questions, the length and type of mentorship. And for future research, I think we should really explore that, because I know a lot of people that like get, like as you said, after school tutoring, and it doesn't help them as much as like, like one-on-one or like kind of every day, like I feel like we're so lucky to be in a program that helps us and is able to help us every day. And I think it really affects us differently than someone who might, not be like someone who only sits down for like 2 hours.
Yay.
Awesome.
Do you have
Lots
another
to think
question?
about there. I have one more question for you, and it is, what surprised you most about conducting your research? While you think about the answer to that, I am just going to pop up that you have some fans in the chat who are congratulating you on all of your work. And so each of you can have different answers, obviously, but what surprised you most about like conducting the research, or maybe what you found?
Me personally, I think what surprised me the most was the graphs that showed no significant difference. So I would expect like first generation students to a little feel a little bit less motivated or have lower GPAs, because that's the stereotypes that have been like enforced on us by society. However, it really made me proud to see that a lot of first generation students are as equal as non-first generation students, or a lot of students who don't receive mentorship are as equal as those who do receive mentorship. So it just shows that really it like really anything is possible, and those variables don't have such an effect like we think they might have.
Yeah. I think especially reading so many articles talking about the stereotypes, it's so good to see like how far like first gen students have come and how they're overcoming those stereotypes. And one thing that I also found really interesting was that on our GPA, like there was like a bigger range in like first gen students, and I think that really shows like kind of where we like, not every first gen student is gonna be like on the top of the GPA or like that's just like a range showing us that like we're kind of overcoming those kind of stereotypes about like our grades. And I think I'm just gonna talk about a general one, how hard it is to get our survey out. I think since we had like kind of like a short amount of time, we are so good for Upper Bound again, because they like made our survey like available everywhere for students to complete. And yeah, I think it's like it's really hard to spread a survey when people like don't know really what it's about. But I think yeah.
Great job, you
Awesome.
two. It's been a pleasure working with you, and you did an amazing job sharing all of the hard work that you've put together. So I'm excited to read the manuscript as well.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Yes, fantastic job. All right. And last but certainly not least for tonight, I'm going to bring up Bria, and she is going to introduce Valentina, our final presentation of the night.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Megan. Yeah, so my background is a little bit more on hard sciences. So when I heard that I had a mentee that was very interested more on the social science aspect, I was very curious and very excited to like have this new opportunity. And she did such an amazing job of just like really taking the subject by like in hand and in stride. And she asked like really good questions and really did really good thought-provoking analysis. So I'm very excited to show all the social science questions and the answers that Valentina found. So go ahead, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, Bria. I'm Valentina Vasquez, and I'll be presenting on social media's contribution on our knowledge and advocacy. Over the last few years, social media has become an essential in our lives. I know a lot of teenagers who spend a lot of time on social media on a daily basis. From sharing our inner thoughts to teaching others new things, social media has provided a creative outlet for everyone. And it has even been used as a way to spread awareness to all kinds of things going on around us. Some studies have even proved that younger generations do care more and are more willing to engage in activism because of social media. However, they have yet to actually engage in civic engagement. And other studies have found that millennials are more active in sharing climate content online, talking about climate issues, and participating in climate protests compared to older generations. But what I wanted to answer was if social media created a greater awareness in Generation Z. The objective of my research was to answer these three questions, but more mainly the last one. The first asked if social media heavily contributes to the knowledge we have on global issues, which I measured by gathering data on the the knowledge that people had and how much they believe that it had helped with them. But primarily, I was researching the question: does social media create a greater awareness of global issues such as climate change and global issues, and a larger influence to tackle them among Generation Z? My final hypothesis was that yes, social media does create a greater awareness of and influences Generation Z to advocate more for global issues than other age groups like millennials and Generation Z X. For my methodology, I used a survey to gather my data, which I shared through social media and QR codes that I printed on paper. And I went into classes and I asked teachers to do the survey and then to share it with the rest of their class. I also printed out the survey on paper to share it with older responders because I know like Gen X citizens aren't very technology advanced. So I wanted to make sure I gathered information from every age group. So I printed out some surveys. The qualitative component of my research was split into two sections. The first measured how much they knew about either climate change or social justice by asking questions like, how much do you know about climate change? Or how much do you know about social justice? And the second measured the differences between each age group, and to gather that information, I just asked how old people were. The quantitative component was split into two sections as well. One highlighted the level of awareness gained from social media on each global issue, while the other distinguished the influence it had on the activism of said issues. Again, gathering data with questions like, how much do you think social media has contributed to your understanding of climate change or social justice? And how much social media has influenced them to advocate or inspired them to advocate. To test my hypothesis, I used linear regression tests and an analysis of variance or an ANOVA test. I began by testing the overall contribution that social media had on all of the responders. Each test measured a different global issue. The first was climate change, where I compared just the overall general knowledge of every single person that had responded to my survey to what they believed, again, social media had contributed to it. The R-squared value was 0.02, which showed a very weak correlation, and it had a 0.21 p-value that revealed little to no indication that there was a relationship, which ultimately revealed to me that social media didn't have an effect on the knowledge that people have on climate change. As you can see on the left side right here, knowledge on social justice issues, on the other hand, uncovered that the R-squared value was 0.09, which showed a very weak correlation, but it had a p-value of 0.02 that revealed it was statistically significant, which overall meant that the knowledge we have on social justice issues is impacted by social media, as you can see on the right side, on the bottom right side right here. For these next sets of tests, I focused on just climate change. The first test, which isn't pictured on here, focused on gaining background information by just measuring each age group's knowledge on climate change. That displayed that everyone had a general knowledge of around 7 on a 1 to 10 scale. So with that, I continued to measure how social media had contributed to this. The p-value was 0.01, which meant that there was an extremely strong confidence that the groups are different. And after analyzing the post-HOC test, it was revealed that social media had similar contributions on Gen Z and millennials, but not on Gen X's knowledge of climate change, which you can see here at the top, which meant that that social media does influence the knowledge that we have on climate change, but only in Gen Z and millennials. You can see Gen Z is a little bit higher than millennials, which really informed me on my final conclusion. Lastly, I evaluated the influence social media had on the advocacy in each age group, which meant like how much they wanted to advocate for said issue, so climate change. The p-value of 0.17 revealed there was some indication that the groups might be different, but not enough to come to the conclusion that it made an impact. And the final outcome was that social media did not have different contributions on the advocacy people had for climate change, as you can see at the bottom. Each group had very similar rates for advocacy after social media, so there wasn't much of a difference there. And finally, these next sets focused on social justice. I ran the same 3 tests as before. The first, again, was just to gain some background knowledge on on how much they already knew about the issue, which revealed that everyone had an average understanding of 6.5 on a 1 to 10 scale, as you can see. Oh, that's not pictured, sorry. The second revealed a p-value of less than 0.01, which showed that there is an extremely strong confidence that the groups were different. And after analyzing the post-HOC test, it was clear that Generation Z and millennials had gained similar levels of their knowledge from social media, while Generation X didn't, which demonstrated that social media has significantly different contributions on each age group's knowledge of the social justice issues around them. As you can see at the top, you can see that millennials and Gen Zers are way above Gen X. With advocacy, there was a p-value of less than 0.01 as well, which again meant an extremely strong confidence that the groups were different. And in the end, I found that Gen Z and millennials were very similarly influenced by social media to advocate for social justice, while Gen X wasn't, as you can see at the bottom of the slide. Again, you can see the major difference in between the millennials and Gen Z and the Gen X. In conclusion, I found that for global issues like climate change, social media created a small difference in the knowledge of Gen Z and millennials, but didn't increase the levels of activism for either. And for global issues like social justice, social media was a very big factor in the knowledge of Gen Z and influenced a higher level of advocacy in Gen Z and millennials. And after evaluating all of my test results, I came to the final conclusion that social media does create a deeper understanding of global issues and influences advocacy more in Generation Z than in other age groups. Although I also did find that millennials are almost as equally influenced by social media. Before letting you guys ask some questions, I want to take this time to thank everyone who supported me. Firstly, I want to thank Bria, my mentor, for supporting me and my research. Without her, I would not have a research project, so thank you so much. I also want to thank Megan and the whole Headwaters team for allowing me to have this amazing learning experience and teaching me new research skills that I will definitely be using in the future. And I want to give especially a big thanks to Mr. Rowe and La Fuerza Latina from Truckee High School for introducing me to this new opportunity and financially supporting me so it could be possible for me to be here. And finally, I want to give a big thanks to my friends and family for supporting me through this journey and proofreading all my things before turning them in.
Awesome job, Valentina. You have a really cool project and did a lot of work there with a lot of different results there to figure out. I have a first question for you because it's kind of on your background research and feels like a good first question to start at the beginning. Did you think about or find anything in your background research about the different social media platforms that the different generations might prefer?
I didn't really find anything in my background information, but just from the survey that I did find that millennials are more likely to choose Facebook over any other platform like Instagram or TikTok or Snapchat or YouTube. Although now that I think about it, Instagram and Facebook were kind of at equal levels for millennials.
Interesting. Awesome. I wonder if that has anything to do with it, just in terms of the different algorithms or different types of information that gets shared. Could be an interesting further question.
I did test that, but in the end, it didn't really kind of contribute as much to my research that I wanted it to, so I didn't really use it.
Fair enough. Sometimes that happens. Maybe it doesn't make a difference. Bria, do you have questions?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the questions I had, I thought was really interesting because the two topics, one's social media and one's climate change, those are very they can be combined, but they're mostly pretty separate. Why do you think one contributed like social media contributed influence to being more active with social justice, but it didn't really make an effect on being like an advocate for climate change or why do you think that is?
I think it's more because climate change isn't very popular right now, I guess you could say. I feel like right now, what's more on social media, coming from my own personal perspective and what I see a lot on social media, is a lot of the political issues that are going on around us right now, or just overall things that are very sensitive to humans, the genocides that are happening across the world or stuff like that. And I feel like right now that's kind of, I don't mean to sound insensitive, but I feel like that's kind of what's trending. And I feel like climate change has kind of died down over the last few years.
Oh, do you see there being more of a change in upcoming years as more fires happen, the weather gets more extreme? Do you think more people will be influenced, or do you think people will still be more focused on the here and now?
I think based on what I saw, the more generations that come that are introduced to technology at younger ages, the more that they get influenced to advocate. It's just a matter of actually going out and advocating. That's the problem. But I definitely do see more advocacy from younger generations.
Okay. And I think my last question is based on some of your results showing that social media does influence overall. Do you think that's more of a push for us to use just social media in general? What do you think?
Honestly, I do think we should. I think it's a very, very good way of getting anything out there. It's a way that you can reach a lot of minorities and social groups and classes without having any kind of restrictions. And I just think it's a really great way to just spread any kind of information you want. Even if it's fake, it's still very it travels around very fast, and I think that's what really benefits how we have more awareness from it.
Okay. Those are all my questions.
Great. You have a question from the audience. I think you've answered maybe part of this already, but I did want to ask at least the first part here. Did you find any social issues that come up more frequently than others?
I didn't test any specific issues. I kind of just focused on the general social justice issues and general climate change, kind of trying to gather how much information everyone had. But I think that would definitely be a very good question to research more deeply in the future. So, yeah.
Great. The other part here, if you have anything to add, they're also wondering what could your research imply or what can it be used for? And like, if you're thinking about spreading information and, encouraging action or something, would you be using it to target different age groups, or what do you think?
I think my research could be used to kind of prove to people that social media isn't all negative, because I feel like that's a very big stigma right now, that it's all negative and that it just feeds a lot of negativity into our lives. So I feel like my research could be used as a way to kind of contradict that and prove to people that it also helps us become more open-minded as humans. And I feel like it's targeting younger age groups, but I think that also benefits it, because the younger you target an age group, the younger they're gonna wanna make a difference in our world, and I think that in the long run, that'll make a really big impact in our society.
Awesome. Great answers. And then my final question to you was, what was your favorite part of your research experience?
My favorite part was definitely playing around in data classroom, where we made all our graphs and seeing like just playing with the colors and playing, even if it had nothing to do with my research. I would test like TikTok engagement levels with the ethnicity you are and how like that is, like just to mess around with it. I really enjoyed that part of it. It was very intriguing to me, which was actually very surprising too.
Awesome. It's sometimes really fun to see all of your hard work and like pulling all of these numbers, and then you can stick it in there, and like instead of just being a spreadsheet, then you have something that's visual and you can really look at it and like see what it means. So yeah, that's awesome. And a fun way to come up with new questions too.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, great work, Valentina, and thank you both. And wonderful job, everybody, tonight. We had an amazing group of students this winter semester here, with some really different topics and some really robust data sets and lots of analysis. And so we're really excited to see them finish up those manuscripts, and we'll have those published here in the spring with our next issue of the journal. And we do have a summer semester of the research experience as well. And so those spots are open if anyone is thinking that this sounds like a fantastic experience and you want to get in on all of the fun. You can find that link on our website. But Hugo, Dia, Itzel, and Valentina, wonderful job. Thank you all so much for coming and joining us and listening and asking great questions and supporting these wonderful students. I hope you all have a great rest of your evening, and we will see you next time for our next round of presentations.